Hi, I'm Mike, and today I'm going to be talking about 4K video on Canon cameras. Now, to be honest, when I started thinking about this video, I had almost planned to make it like a Canon 4K intervention, because I was really tired, and this whole thing breaks down to the crop factor that Canon cameras have on 4K video. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating when you're trying to record 4K and you have to have a much wider lens than you would usually need to record that video. But the more I looked into it, I've now kind of come to terms with, well, this is the choice that was made, and this choice has its benefits. Let's talk a little bit more about how I came to that realization. So what is this 4K crop factor that we're talking about? Basically what it boils down to is that when recording video at 4K, Canon is actually only taking the middle section of pixels from the image sensor. So a 4K video would have about 8 megapixels, 4K across and 2K down. But when you have a larger megapixel sensor, like in a camera with 20 or 30 megapixels, you have a lot more area to work with. And so the method that they use to pick those 8,000 or 8 million pixels is by basically chopping off the sides and just using from the center. So depending on how many megapixels your camera has on the sensor, that dictates what your crop factor is. On the top end here, and right now I have listed here, these are all the cameras that either the mirrorless or the DSLR cameras that Canon sells that has that will record 4K video. I don't include the cinema cameras here because I feel like that's kind of a different league. If you're buying a cinema camera, then you know more about what you need than I do, to be honest. So these are the cameras that Canon sells that are either DSLRs currently or mirrorless. On the top end we have a 30 megapixel sensor in the 5D Mark IV, which I'm recording this video on, and the EOS R. And since you have a 30 megapixel sensor, your crop factor is 1.75. Moving down the range, if you go to the newly announced EOS RP, that only has a 26 megapixel sensor, and so your crop factor is about 1.6. And the first digital SLR that Canon brought out that supported 4K video was the 1DX Mark II. And since that's only a 20 megapixel sensor, its crop factor is a much more mild 1.42. So there's definitely a difference in between there. Now I skipped these two in the middle for a reason. The whole thing that got me thinking of this video was that yesterday the SL3 came out, and it had a very high crop factor for its 4K video. It uses a similar sensor as the EOS M50. There is a slight difference in the actual pixels. The sensor itself is a little bit different, and so their crop factors are slightly different. But they range anywhere from 2.56 to 2.64, which is really high. But what this actually is, and in this situation, the reason those are so high is because they are crop sensor cameras. And so that 1.6x is actually being multiplied by another 1.6 to come up with these values. But it's still, I mean, it's still definitely an issue though, because it's something where when you're kind of working with like a 24 millimeter lens, you're not expecting it to be zoomed in that far when you're recording video. So what does it mean? Basically, like if say you're on a 24 millimeter lens, if you're using it with the 5D Mark IV, that 1.75x crop means that you're really using about a 42 millimeter lens, which is not wide angle at all. It's much more normal to getting borderline telephoto. So that's definitely, it means that you have to move your camera back farther from what you're recording. It also means that since you're doing that, you're losing some of the benefits of a full frame camera with its ability to, since you have a bigger sensor, you can get less depth of field and for more creativity. And so when you move back, you lose that smaller depth of field, and you just it just limits you when you're trying to record video. So I was getting kind of frustrated about this, and I mean, it's frustrating from a standpoint of somebody who's using the camera. But in reality, after researching this some more, I figured out that really this might be the best option, at least for the time being. So let me explain what I mean by that. Now, there are several ways to do 4K video when you have camera sensors. One is this that I described, to take the middle section of pixels and use that as the ones that you're reading for 4K. Now, what's the benefit of that? The benefit is that when the camera is reading those pixels off the sensor is only giving those pixels to the digic processor. And so the digic processor is getting fewer pixels to work with. It doesn't need to do as much processing to them to actually record them to the card and do the image adjustments that they do in camera. So that's less data that the digic processor needs to work with. And so you get, basically, you have something where you improve your battery life, and because you're using less processing power. There's a couple other ways that they could do this, though, and that would result in the whole frame being used. And the two ways that I came across doing this is either pixel skipping or binning, depending on the method, or the other option is to grab the full frame image from the sensor and do scaling on the digic processor itself. Let's talk first about doing it with the pixel binning or skipping. What that means is that if you take, say going across this image, like with the 5D Mark IV, you have about, I think it's about 6,700 pixels across, and you only want 4,000 of them. So basically what that would result in is you would kind of skip almost every other pixel. Or you would take like an average of the pixels and one right around it to kind of, and that would be the pixel binning, where you combine pixels and take that as your pixel in the video. The problem with doing this is that you end up with, if you don't have a nice multiple, like say you didn't have like a multiple of 2 where you could skip every other row, or because here, I mean, you would only have to skip certain amounts. Then what you end up with is more moire, like a more moire. But you end up with moire in the image when you do something like this. And the other drawback is that when you have the noise in like a higher ISO video, instead of being like a nice grain to look at, it's actually it's kind of more blotchy when it shows up like using this method. And so those are definitely drawbacks that I think are worthwhile. To me, I would rather, if you have to deal with those in post, those are much harder to deal with in post than compensating for the crop factor. And so I think the crop factor is actually the better solution in that case. The other option, which is actually in my mind a better option depending on how you look at it, is what's done in the Sony, the A7R III right now. Basically what it does is it takes the full readout of the image sensor, and I think in the Sony's case it might be a 6K image, and from that then you would actually on the processor, on the digic processor, you would then reduce the size of that image down to a 4K image before saving it out to video. And so there's real benefits to that. One is usually when you're reducing an image, if you're doing it in software like that, you can actually improve the sharpness of the image. I mean, it won't quite be the same sharpness as just like this, of taking just the middle pixels, but it will, in general, whenever you shrink an image, if you do it in a certain way, like you can actually get more sharpness out of it. That also reduces the amount of noise that you see, because if you have like a noisy image and you make it smaller, then the noise is less apparent. And so those are two real benefits. The drawback of doing it like that is that you have to have a sensor that has, sensors have limits in how much bandwidth they have when reading out an image. And so when doing that at 24 frames a second, or ideally at like 30 or 60 frames per second, you need to have a sensor that can handle all that bandwidth. Furthermore, on the digic side, like, or whatever processors in the camera, you have to that processor has to be fast enough to actually be able to resize those large images while it's taking the video. And that could be difficult, because when you have, the processor has to be bringing in all this data that's uncompressed, because that's how it comes in off the sensor, and then it has to compress that data and resize that data before actually encoding it into a movie file. And that it can be intensive. Well, Sony's doing this, and that's great. They've created a processor that's fast enough to do this. But the drawback is that when the processor is working on this, your battery life is gonna tank, because you're using a lot of extra power to actually do this operation. Now, the third method that I talked about, where you're binning pixels or skipping pixels, that actually would become a valid solution with none of the battery drawbacks that I talked about earlier. But only once image sensors get up to be a certain size, a certain number of megapixels. And I calculated that out to be approximately 45 megapixels. When you have a 45 megapixel sensor, then your sensor is about 8,000 pixels across. And then you, depending on the ratio, usually it's a 3:2 ratio for the height. But once you get to that point, then really you are just skipping every other pixel. So the moire is less of an issue, and also, like, when you're doing that, you're only getting a fraction of the data off the sensor, so you have less processing time, less battery, because you're not resizing it in the digit processor and stuff like that. And then furthermore, if you do the pixel binning, if you say, okay, these 4 pixels are going to be 1 video pixel, then you also gain light sensitivity, because what you're doing is giving a larger area on the sensor to that particular pixel, so your noise levels are going to go down, just as if you had resized the image smaller on the processing side. So I can see maybe when Canon gets to the point where they're shipping cameras in the 45 megapixel range, or slightly more, they would start to switch to that, and basically then you would gain this extra ability to do a full frame 4K image. So, like I said, when I started researching this video, I was all about making this an intervention for Canon 4K development. But in the end, I've kind of come to terms with that's a good way to go, because one, you save on the processing power, you don't have to resize an image and burn that extra battery life, and you get all the benefits of sharpness and so forth that comes from picking pixels that are adjacent to each other and in the center of the image sensor. It's still a struggle to work around, though, and I definitely appreciate that it's something that you need to consider as a photographer or as a videographer when purchasing a camera, that this is something that you have to look at to see if it's something you can work with. If you do a lot of wide-angle photography or videography, like you would if you do a lot of like time-lapse or videos of landscapes or something, then that probably would come into play for you when you're purchasing a camera. So it's definitely something to look at. Not all cameras shoot 4K the same as, it's not the same 4K. Even with this, when you're looking at different crop factors, there's so many other things that come into play with the encoding and the bit rates and so forth. There's all these different variables. But when looking just at the crop factor, it's not unreasonable to choose this as a way to implement a camera from the perspective of the Canon engineers that are working on these. If you have any questions about how this works, or if you have any other comments, maybe something I missed, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it. Otherwise, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to subscribe. I release videos on photography and technology every couple of weeks. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.